Welcome, welcome, welcome. Season one, episode one. Here we are. I am so excited to be kicking off this really special project off. And I thought that a great place to begin would be to kind of share a little bit about my story and how did I get here, right? How did I go from serving as a therapist to transitioning and pivoting to coaching entrepreneurs and really centering my thought leadership around the intersection of entrepreneurship and emotional health. This is probably the first time that I'm sharing the behind the scenes story, the full story. So let's get into it. And just for some background, after years of serving clients one on one as a therapist, I left the field and gave up my license, which is actually quite uncommon in our field. This moment of calling the New York State Board and releasing my license was a few years in the making. I didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what? I'm going to pivot to entrepreneurship. Providing therapy was my second career. I had a 12-year career in the education space. I started off as a teacher. I taught kindergarten. That was my favorite grade. I taught other elementary school grades and then transitioned to a leadership position as an assistant principal. It was called the dean at this particular school, but it's kind of the same role. After suffering a few panic attacks, all related to burnout, all related to stress, I really decided to kind of get out of the hamster wheel that I'd been running on for years. And in fact, it was those panic attacks that kind of jolted me out of the hamster wheel. And so I left the education space, took a year off to really nurture myself from the depths of burnout. And I'll never forget during that time, I was just doing a lot of reflecting. And I remember the moment when I remembered what I've always wanted to do. And that was to provide therapy. Once I came to that remembering, it was just like, this is it. I'm going to do the thing that I've always wanted to do. And, therapy has always been a constant in my life, since I was in my mid 20s. I'm about to, head into my 40s now. So it's been a minute. It completely changed my life and really changed the trajectory of my relationships with myself, with my family, partners, friends, etc. It wasn't just that therapy was really important to me and kind of that's why I wanted to pivot into therapy. It was just that as a true Libra sun, relationships are my jam. In fact, the part that I love the most about being a teacher and being a school leader was the relationship that I had with students and families and being able to really facilitate healing through those relationships. So it made a lot of sense for me that I would go on to become certified in couples and family therapy once I got my therapy license and became a therapist and really wanted to find a specialization. Here I was, had left the education space, had made the decision to do what I've always wanted to do, which was provide therapy. And so obviously I had to go back to grad school. And I was very clear that once I graduated, I would work for myself. Except that once I got to grad school, everywhere that I turned, everyone, told me, and the kind of the messages that I got was that I had to work for pennies after taking out six figures in student loans and maybe wait a decade before I could see six figures. Nah. My double Sagittarius and generator behind was like, oh no. We is not doing that. Myra's daughter, Leela's granddaughter, not doing that. So, true to form, I made a way where there wasn't one. I started to build my audience online while I was in grad school, and that helped me graduate with a double-digit wait list, for folks interested in doing therapy, even before I had a degree or license, right? Folks were hitting me up on my DMs like, where's the wait list? I really want to work with you. And I started working for myself upon graduation, despite there being very little support for that. 8 months later, I made my first $100,000 in business. I had a full practice. I was working on launching my second business, a group coaching program for therapists. And so, things were good. I was hustling. I was making more money than I'd ever made. I was serving, clients one on one. And, my practice was 100% Black and Latinx women and couples. So I felt really good about the work that I was doing and the impact that I was making. I was supporting therapists, coaching therapists who really wanted to break out the mold and, really do work that they wanted to do on their terms. I was getting speaking engagements, working with powerful brands like HBO and Spotify. I was in my prime, if you will. And then one day, one day, I am sitting at my altar, and one of my ancestors says, "You're more than a therapist." And I want to put an asterisk here because I'll be sharing a lot more about my spirituality and spiritual practices, but just know that I come from a lineage of healers with roots in La 21 Divisiones, which is a syncretic faith from the Dominican Republic that is heavily framed around West African voodoo. And I'm not a member of that community, but ancestor veneration is central to my spiritual practice. I also have intuitive abilities, mainly clear audience and clear sentience, and can connect with spirit guides, both my own and that of others. And so we're going to put a pin on that. You're probably wondering, girl, what are you saying an ancestor said that to you? But I'll be sharing a lot more about my spirituality and spiritual practices and really how I infuse that into my coaching work with entrepreneurs as the season evolves. So stay tuned. So here I am sitting at my altar. I hear this wisdom. Y'all, I had a physical response. Something in me felt threatened. Like I could not figure out what was happening. I remember I started feeling hot. My heart was beating fast. And here's the thing, I know I didn't hear wrong. Ancestors don't be stuttering. If you know, you know. They say what they say. And, it was only a handful of words, but I knew the subtext. I knew what they weren't saying. And that was, Josie, you need to shed this identity. If you are to really fulfill your purpose in this lifetime, you need to shed this identity because it's not all of who you are. And if we take this a step further, this wisdom was a portal of sorts for me, a way for me to really get curious and vulnerable about the fact that my identity and my worth had always been intertwined with my accomplishments. I was a smart kid growing up, right? Academically, I started off in a gifted and talented program, went to boarding school. I have 2 degrees from Columbia University, and professionally, I have some pretty powerful brands on my resume. I've done some pretty impressive stuff. And, given my upbringing, I've done a lot of that on my own. It's just no wonder that somewhere along that trajectory, the line of who I am and what I did or what I produced got blurred. It literally became one and the same. And so you add to that layers of my identity and social location, right? And just like lived experiences like childhood trauma and being Black, being a woman, being a daughter of immigrants, right? Living in a capitalist society that just wants you to produce. It's a perfect equation to blur the lines and blur the two, right? Who you are and what you produce. And honestly, it's a perfect equation for disconnection, right? To disconnect you from who you are. I mean, just think about it. When people ask you, what do you do? How do you typically respond? It's some version of I am da 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 da, right? And that's not by mistake, that's by design. But that's a different conversation for a different day. And so you can only imagine that here I am getting this guidance, getting this wisdom that who you are is not what you do. It really shook shit up for me. I, for a long time, just felt validated by all of the things that I accomplished. It meant that I mattered. And just saying that, I had to take a nice deep breath there because I see a version of me and I feel such compassion and pride, honestly, for that version of myself who learned to survive because that's really what it's about. In a world that's designed to make you feel inferior, ugly, less than, especially if you identify as a woman, you're going to figure out how not to feel inferior, ugly, less than, etc. And so I had bubble wrapped myself against the harshness of the world and my lived experiences with my education and accomplishments. And I think that for a lot of you who are listening, you probably have a very similar experience, right? And so here I was with this question of, well, who am I really? And not surprisingly, nor coincidentally, because I do not believe in coincidences, this was around the same time that I was deep in healing, recovering from a very painful breakup. And one of the themes that had come up in therapy and during that process of healing was this theme of self abandonment, right? I was sitting with all of the ways that I had abandoned myself, especially interpersonally. That led me with this question of, well, what are my true needs and wants? And so here I was kind of going through this parallel process, both personally and professionally, asking myself these really deep kind of existential questions of, well, who are you? And what are your true needs? And what are your true desires? Because you see, you can't know what you need unless you know who you are. And I've spoken about this a lot online, especially my social media. Like, who are you? We constantly have to be coming back to that question. And that question colors, our understanding of our needs and our wants and our values, right? Needless to say, it was all a process of deep, deep self discovery that spanned a few years. I had to also, which I was not expecting, I also had to contend with some like pretty deep shame and shaming from others, quite honestly, when I started to decouple myself from what I did because I started to see that they were related but they were not the same thing. And so when I say that I had to decouple who I was from what I did, it's this thought that I can be a facilitator of personal transformation and be a champion for folks of color, and that work and who I was not the same thing. And the fact that those things were not intertwined didn't necessarily mean that I didn't care, right? It didn't mean that I wasn't a sellout. I had to really work through that, right? And on the other side, I learned that one of the best ways to do good, impactful work, care for yourself, your mission, and the people that it serves is actually by being super and ruthlessly clear about the distinction between the two, right? There has to be a very clear line of demarcation. The more I leaned into getting to know myself, my true self, without the adornments of degrees and titles and accolades and clinical jargon, the more showing up and serving as a therapist started to feel like, them pair of jeans that everyone has that just does not fit? That's kind of how it felt, right? And I remember this critical moment when I asked myself, if I didn't have this title of therapist, how would I show up in the world differently? What kinds of ideas would I share? Would I put out my gifts out into the world differently? And y'all, the expansion I felt in my chest as I was thinking and reflecting about this question, and just the expansion that I felt in my overall body is just something that I'll never forget, right? Not having that title for me meant that I could starfish, right? If we were to use starfish as a verb, it meant that I could take up space, right? Not because I had worked for it, but because it was mine. The space was mine. It was already there. I just had to take it, right? And so that's when my cognitive knowing matched my bodily wisdom. I knew that as I was reflecting and sitting with these like really big questions, I knew that I was outgrowing this therapist title, right? And so once that integration happened, it was really about figuring out the logistics, right? When it came to, how do I leave this identity behind, right? Like, how do I grow it? How do I shed it in a way that makes sense? And the absolute easiest part was the logistical piece, right? It took all of 2 minutes. I called the New York State Board, told them I didn't want to practice therapy anymore. I clicked the button online, and that was the end of that, literally. And so all of that has led me to this place where instead of leading with a title or role that communicated what I produced, I now lead with who I truly am. And, if a title fits, great. But if it doesn't, that's fine because it really doesn't matter anymore. And I use the word, I use the title and the word coach because it's probably the closest shared language that we have. But honestly, language is limited. And quite honestly, if I'm being super honest, I'm a dynamic experience more so than any title can really capture. And so from me, you can expect serious disruptor energy, meaning that I am always going to call out the ways of being and thinking that simply don't work and really keep us oppressed and shackled and keep us away from really fulfilling our purpose in this lifetime. You can expect thought leadership about entrepreneurship, personal development sprinkled in with conversations about spirituality, generational cycle breaking, wealth and legacy building, and all of the good stuff, right? Divesting from the idea that who I am equals what I produce has also allowed me to make space for the very divine feminine and masculine parts of me, right? Like I no longer have to choose. I can be this really masterful holder of sacred space and facilitator of transformation, but I could also be in my analytical bag and do kick-ass strategy work, which I really love, right? And so it's really important for me to begin this podcast in this way and share this story because it's likely that you are also an entrepreneur, you're a leader within a company, or you're just a leader in your particular space. And you probably also hold multiple identities that make it easy for you to think that what you produce is who you are. And I want you to know that that's bullshit. I want to invite you to divest from that thinking. It's oppressive, wrong, and it really makes life unnecessarily harder as an entrepreneur. Okay. And so to kind of wrap things up here, I really want to leave you with three powerful questions for you to reflect on. And if you feel called, use it as insight to take inspired action. One, answer the question, what do you do without saying I am fill in the blank? Two, I want you to answer the question, who are you, without speaking about your work, without speaking about your business, without speaking about your title, without speaking about your degree. Answer the question, who are you? Who am I? Right? And number three, who are you most afraid of disappointing if you decouple who you are from what you do? Okay? Happy reflecting.